Hello and welcome to the historynetwork.org podcast. If you would like to become a patron of the podcast, and we'd love you to, then just pop along to patreon.com/the History Network and find out about becoming a patron there. Thank you to all our patrons who do make this podcast possible. The historynetwork.org podcast, season 32, episode 9, the Castilian Civil War, 1350 to 1369. This episode was written by Murray Dahm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is a regular writer on this podcast and a regular contributor to the Ancient Warfare podcast. A bitter war between legitimate and illegitimate heirs was fought for the throne of 14th century Castile. The ensuing conflict pulled in many powers, large and small, including both the kingdoms of England and France. On March 26, 1350, Alfonso XI, King of Castile, Leon and Galicia, died during yet another siege, the fifth of Muslim-held Gibraltar, and in the midst of an outbreak of the Black Death, which would soon decimate the populations of almost all of Europe. Alfonso had been king since 1312, and his death plunged Castile into a succession crisis. Alfonso and his wife, Maria of Portugal, had only one surviving legitimate son, Pedro, but Alfonso had neglected his wife in favour of his mistress, Eleanor de Guzman, by whom he had 10 illegitimate children. These included the twins Henry and Frederic Alfonso, and it would be Henry de Trastamara, Alfonso's eldest surviving illegitimate male heir, around whom an alternative claim to the Castilian throne centred. The legitimate heir to Alfonso's crown was the 16-year-old Pedro, who quickly became known as El Cruel, the Cruel, by those who opposed him. He was known as El Justiciero, the Just, to his supporters. The sources upon which we rely for our accounts of the Civil War have multiple issues, especially the Chronicles of Pedro Lopez de Ayala and the Chronicles of Jean Froissart. Ayala served both Pedro and later Henry, and is the main source of both the positive and negative accounts of Pedro. The positive accounts followed later. As soon as Pedro became king in 1350, his mother Maria and her supporters at court exerted control over him. Maria had Eleanor de Guzman arrested and put to death in 1351. Eleanor's children, including Henry, had begun agitating against Pedro and his court, but when she was put to death, Henry fled to Portugal. An attempt at reconciliation between Pedro and Henry was made, but Henry then fled to France and served the French king Jean II. Several marriages were arranged for Pedro by his mother Maria and her supporters. These were quickly annulled or failed to be recognised, but they showed that Pedro was unable to escape the manipulations of Maria's court. Pedro was able to extricate himself from the influences of his mother's courtiers in 1356 and immediately launched a war against Aragon. This was in part over Castile's claim to Valencia, then a part of Aragon, and on Aragon's part a wish to dominate the Mediterranean by lessening Castile's influence, as well as the influence of Castile's ally, Genoa. This conflict was known as the War of the Two Peters. The Aragonese king was Pedro IV. During this period, Pedro of Castile also had Jewish agents, and his Muslim bodyguards carry out acts of tyranny for him. He had his queen, Blanche of Bourbon, imprisoned, and in 1361 may have orchestrated her murder by poison or crossbow. The murder of Blanche may have been out of a fear that she would be rescued by Aragonese forces. The strong anti-Jewish feeling at the time led to riots, but Pedro had the leaders of these riots put to death. It was during the war with Aragon, however, that Pedro truly earned a reputation for cruelty. He perpetrated a series of murders, putting men to death without trial, which utterly destroyed any reputation he had for upholding justice. Pedro had continued the work of his father in strengthening royal power, and his actions forced the Castilian nobility to turn against him. The merchants and peasants enjoyed security under Pedro, however, and that popularity may have led to the softening of attitudes towards Pedro later. He was also remembered positively by Geoffrey Chaucer. When Pedro entered into the unwanted war with Aragon, the Castilian nobility, Aragon, and France, as well as the papacy, gave their support to Henry de Trastamara to become King of Castile as Henry II and found a new royal dynasty, de Trastamara. Henry and his troops even fought for Aragon against Castile in 1358. Henry was, however, defeated and exiled to France. In addition to Pedro's sullied reputation, Henry also used anti-Jewish sentiment against his half-brother. Pedro's treasurer, Samuel Halevi, was Jewish, and Henry addressed Pedro as King of the Jews. This, and Pedro's bad faith, even with his allies, such as Edward III of England and his son the Black Prince, sealed his fate. In 1366, Henry gathered a large army of Castilian allies, troops from Aragon and France, and English mercenaries, and invaded Castile. Pedro fled in the face of Henry's advance, perpetrating more murders as he fled, such as the murder of the Archbishop and Dean of Santiago. Henry then proclaimed himself King of Castile and Leon and Calahorra. Pedro, meanwhile, fled to Bordeaux and sought the help of the English and Edward, the Black Prince. A treaty between England and Castile had been signed in 1362. The use of French and English troops in the Castilian Civil War at this time means that it is considered a part, even if a peripheral one, of the 100 Years' War between England and France. Both sides hired English and English allied soldiers of fortune from Gascony and Aquitaine, despite attempts by the English King Edward III to stop troops fighting on the side of Henry. In order to not be seen as breaking the terms of the peace treaty between France and England signed in 1360, Prince Edward represented Aquitaine rather than England in his service to Pedro. The Black Prince raised an army of 8,000 to 10,000 mercenaries from a wide variety of sources. They probably intended to plunder Castile when they were victorious. Pedro agreed to pay Edward for the cost of recruiting this army, and Edward then invaded Castile through Navarre. Henry had dismissed most of his own mercenary army by this time, as it was too expensive to maintain, and these troops had remained in Castile plundering the countryside. Some units even switched sides to join with the Black Prince. When Henry learned of the invasion by Pedro and Prince Edward, he set about rehiring troops, but he was vastly outnumbered, probably by at least 2 to 1. Edward had a force consisting almost entirely of hardened mercenaries, whereas Henry's force only had 1,000 French soldiers of fortune, although these were the best men the respected and feared soldier of fortune Bertrand du Guesclin could muster. Bertrand was known as the Eagle of Brittany, and was one of the greatest soldiers of his age. Froissart's version has an Anglo-Castilian force of 24,000 against a vastly superior 76,000 men of the Franco-Castilian army. A much lower number of troops in both the armies of Henry and Edward are to be preferred, although Henry was probably still massively outnumbered. Henry initially had several successes engaging in guerrilla tactics, but the two forces met at the Battle of Nájera in April 1367. During a night march, the Black Prince manoeuvred his army behind the forces of Henry, which had been in a strong defensive position. Thus surprised, Henry's army was forced to charge the enemy. This charge was led by Bertrand du Guesclin and his elite French mercenaries. The superior numbers of the English force then threatened to outflank the charge, as well as taking a toll with longbowmen and crossbowmen. Despite several attempts by Henry himself to charge the mercenaries, his cavalry refused to fight dismounted, as they considered it beneath their honour. Henry's army broke and fled, but were caught at the narrow bridge at Najera, suffering up to 50% casualties. The Battle of Najera is remarkable, since it pitted Bertrand against the Black Prince, another of the greatest soldiers of the age. Du Guesclin was a low-born Breton knight and a vital commander during the 100 Years' War, as well as Henry of Trastamara's mercenary commander, who won for him the throne of Castile. In the aftermath of the disastrous defeat of the French at Poitiers in 1356, it was Du Guesclin's successes which played an important part in rebuilding French morale. He withstood English campaigns by using guerrilla tactics, which he would later re-employ with Henry, and Bertrand was used by the new French king, Charles, as a trusted commander. Bertrand defeated King Charles II of Navarre in a battle at Cocherel in 1364, but was then captured by the English at the Battle of Auray later that year. Charles ransomed him, and in 1366 he joined Henry of Trastamara as his mercenary captain. The two had known each other when serving under the French king, Jean II. When Henry was crowned in 1366, he named Bertrand as his successor. Henry escaped the field at Najera and fled back to France. His reputation, however, facing a superior force and bravely leading cavalry charges in person, had been enhanced among the Castilian nobility, nor did it take long for Pedro to squander his victory, or for him to poison his relationship with his allies and the Black Prince. Prince Edward was offended by Pedro's immorality. He was unfaithful to his wife, as his father had been, and his ferocity. Pedro also refused to pay for the expedition, as he had agreed to do at Bayonne before the invasion. Prince Edward therefore returned to Aquitaine, having lost 1/5 of his men to dysentery, and having contracted an illness himself, which would ultimately be the cause of his own death in 1376. The losses for England and Edward were vast in terms of money and manpower. What is more, England had thus lost its alliance with Castile in favour of France. France's alliance with Henry of Castile would be a strong bulwark against England heading into the 1370s. Left on his own, Pedro was forced to fight on. He retreated to Andalusia, and Galicia and Asturias remained loyal to him. Henry, however, soon recovered from his defeat, and those of his men captured at Najera were soon ransomed, and they returned to his side. Du Guesclin had been captured in the aftermath of the Battle of Najera in 1366, but was again ransomed by King Charles of France. With the withdrawal of the Black Prince from Castile, Bertrand again joined Henry. Henry was now recognised as king by a series of cities: Burgos, Cordoba, Palencia, Valladolid, and Jaén. He advanced towards Toledo, and Pedro decided to meet him in battle. In March 1369, Pedro was defeated by Henry and Bertrand at the Battle of Montiel. Du Guesclin surrounded Pedro's army, and the king was forced to flee to Montiel Castle, where he was trapped. During negotiations, Pedro attempted to bribe Du Guesclin to let him escape. Du Guesclin told Henry of this and secured a better offer to remain loyal, and then returned to accept Pedro's offer, bringing Pedro to his tent on the night of March the 23rd, 1369. Du Guesclin surrendered him to Henry, who was waiting for him. They had not seen one another for several years. When Pedro was pointed out to Henry, and had Pedro confirm his identity, Henry hit him in the face with his dagger, and then struck him again and again. King Pedro of the House of Avrere, the last of his line, was dead, his body left unburied for 3 days, during which time it was abused, revealing the depth of feeling the war had generated. The Castilian Civil War was over, and Henry was crowned Henry II of Castile, founder of the House of Trastamara. He would nonetheless be known as El Fratricida. He would reign until 1379, when he was succeeded by his son, John I. Both Henry and John had to fight a series of wars, the Farendine Wars, with King Ferdinand I of Portugal over the legitimacy of their claim to the Spanish throne. The House of Trastamara would remain on the Spanish throne until 1516, when it was replaced by the House of Habsburg under Charles V. Well, thank you once again, Murray, for writing a script for us. If you would like to write a script for us, just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org, and let's discuss your idea. And if you would care to become a patron of the podcast, pop along to patreon.com/thehistorynetwork and sign up there. We would love to have you as a patron. And thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.